He had everything, except the one thing that haunted him in the quiet hours when monitors beeped and portraits looked like judges. He had no son to carry his name forward. Samuel Mwangi was 73, a titan of industry with skyscrapers that bore his initials and a fortune that could buy a small country. But illness had hollowed his nights and left a single fear: to die and leave no legitimate male heir to protect his legacy. The house smelled of antiseptic and old paper, the curtains muting the sun into a soft gray. Doctors said his heart was failing, lawyers spoke about trusts, and his family kept their faces like coin. Samuel whispered a promise to himself that sounded like a prayer and like a plan. It was then that he turned to Aisha, a young housekeeper from the outskirts of Nairobi, a quiet woman who swept in the early hours, whose palms always smelled faintly of cassava and jasmine. He entrusted her with a wish that would split the family and the country in two. Documents, a doctor note, and recorded conversations later would show nothing about that wish was casual. What would you do if the most powerful man in the room asked you to save his name? The decline came with long corridors and breathless afternoons. Medical charts grew thicker, medications multiplied in amber bottles on bedside tables, and monitors kept a tempo that matched the family pulse. Samuel coughed through meetings that once lasted hours, his voice reduced to a hoarse gravel. Dr. Amara Okoro, who had treated him for 3 years, sat with a tablet and explained ejection fractions and risk in clinical tones, while Helena Mwangi, his wife, folded a handkerchief and listened as if inventorying losses. The mansion echoed with the smell of lemon disinfectant and the faint metallic tang of oxygen. Samuel felt his body betray him with each climb of a single faded staircase. His hands trembled, his appetite was gone, and nights were a succession of nausea and small humiliations. The children, Lillian and Marcus, alternated between staged concern and quiet calculation. The estate manager, Tunde, watched the ledger more than the man. There were whispers of a will, murmurs about inheritance. In private, Samuel said things without the politeness that had once lubricated his conversations. He said, "I am tired of being alone," and then, "I need a son who will not sell my name for a ledger." The family heard ambition and vanity. The doctors heard fear. The housekeeper Aisha heard only a man who wanted one last thing arranged before he left the world. Aisha came from a village 2 hours from the city, her back bent from carrying water, her hands marked by work and small careful stitches. She had left school at 13, learned to read by copying labels, and moved to the capital with a single suitcase and an iron will. Her mother, Nneka, had begged her to stay. Her brother, Joseph, had promised to find work. Aisha had taken a job that paid little and offered less dignity. Her first weeks in the Mwangi house were a catalogue of contrasts. Marble floors that reflected chandeliers, kitchens whose knives sang, and a bedroom where old photographs lined the walls like small tribunals. She smelled the perfume of people who never labored, tasted food seasoned for power, and felt the cool leather of chairs no servant sat in. The first time Samuel spoke to her, he asked her name, not as an employer, but as someone who needed to check that he had been heard. She answered in a low voice and fixed a stain on a curtain with fingers that never trembled. She told herself she was invisible, and yet she began to notice things. A safe left ajar. Papers moved at night. A photograph of a young man Samuel kept face down. There was a small kindness that slipped through her work. A smile when she brought him tea. A cautious hand on his wrist when he slept. She had no illusions about power, but she had a hunger for stability, for her family, and for the promise she had made to her mother, that she would build a small house with a corrugated roof that would not leak when the rains came. They met in a room scented with old tobacco and lemon oil, a curtained space that smelled of lemon and his cologne, where the dying man spoke in rapid, quiet sentences. He said, "I have 2 daughters who only count numbers, but no son." He said, "The business needs someone with my blood." He said, "I cannot leave them everything because they will fight over it and tear it apart." Aisha listened, her throat dry, her heartbeat loud enough to be noticed in the hush. He lowered his voice and asked the impossible question. He wanted a trusted person to carry a child, to keep it safe, to raise the boy as his heir. He promised security, money, a small house for her family, a trust in the name of the child, a guarantee sealed with legal paper. He said, "You will not be alone in this." He said, "This must be private." He said, "If you say yes, you will protect my name, and you will protect yourself." The promise smelled like ink and perfume. The decision echoed like a bell. Aisha thought of her mother, of Neka stooping to mend a shirt under a dim bulb, of Joseph, who had been arrested once for a small protest, of little Mariam, who had a cough that always turned worse in winter. She answered with a whisper, "I will do what I can." And then she left the room as if leaving a church. The days that followed were a slow rearrangement of the household. Samuel brought in Dr. Amara for discreet consultations. Kofi Mensah, a sharp, silver-tongued lawyer who had crafted wills for presidents and CEOs, was asked to draft an unusual clause. Helena watched each exchange as if tasting salt. Lillian spoke louder than usual at dinner, and Marcus stopped sleeping on the couch and began sleeping in the study where the ledger smelled of paper and money. Tunda, the estate manager, kept receipts, and receipts kept him. The mood in the house was condensation on glass, a constant fog. Aisha found herself walking past the clinic door with hands that quivered and a stomach that lurched when she thought of injections and tests. She would smell antiseptic, hear the rustle of medical gowns, and feel the cold kiss of a thermometer. Once, after a test, she sat in the kitchen, and a neighbor, Maria from the lane, knocked and came in with mangoes. They sat at a table, and the mango juice left a sticky trail on her fingers. Aisha joked because there was a way to laugh that did not admit fear. The house, in the shadows, kept a secret that pried at the seams of its public life. Their conversations became a refuge for Samuel more than they were arrangements. They talked for hours in a small sitting room with linen drapes, sometimes with the rain tapping on the windows like a nervous audience. He told stories about a childhood when he had stolen mangoes with a friend named Tunda in a dusty market, about the first factory he built with 2 men and a small machine, about the woman he once loved and lost. He addressed her not as a servant, but sometimes as if she were a confidante. There were long dialogues where each sentence changed what they meant. He asked, "Do you ever want something more than you dare say?" And she replied, "I want my mother to sit under a tin roof that does not leak." He said, "I do not trust people who are like family." And she said, "Sometimes family is what you build." They spoke of taste and of salt on the tongue and of the warmth of tea. At night she would bring him warm porridge, the spoon clinking, and he would ask about the small things that mattered to her. The sensory world of these talks was constant, the clink of cutlery, the soft creak of a chair, the lemon scent of his handkerchief, the rough cotton of her sleeves, the warm porridge that tasted of ginger. Over time, a tenderness formed, not in headlines, but in the quiet of shared stories. It was intimate, and it was transactional at once. It was enough to make the household watch, and to make Helena watch with a face like weather. Then the family meeting was convened, a moment that would later be replayed on social feeds and in closed hearing rooms. Around a long table polished to a mirror shine, the family assembled. Marcus, Lillian, Helena, Tunda, and Kofi sat like chess pieces. The air tasted of coffee and strained civility. Samuel cleared his throat and spoke of a contingency plan and of a trust. His voice was small and bright with a single purpose. Helena raised her hand and said, "Are you naming someone outside this family to inherit?" And he said, "Possibly." And she said with a laugh that was more a blade, "You cannot mean Aisha." And he said, "I can and I will." And she whispered, "That woman cannot hold a purse for us." And Lillian said, "We are the legitimate heirs." The room had at least 12 exchanges in rapid sequence as accusations ricocheted. Kofi Mensah, the lawyer, spoke in measured sentences, advising caution and confidentiality. Tunda, the estate manager, took notes, and his pen sounded like a metronome. The atmosphere tightened to the point where someone nearly knocked over a glass. The family watched Aisha in that room as if she were a foreign object, her hands folded, smelling faintly of cassava and the lemon cleaner. There were murmurs of indignation and of humiliation. The conversation spun into threats from Lillian and then into legalese from Kofi. Samuel stood and at one point said with a brittle chuckle, "You think you own my name?" And Marcus answered, "We are the name." The exchanges were surgical. In that room, the household power shifted and a fissure opened that would widen into a chasm. At approximately 33% into this account, the audience hears its first direct call to respond. Pause and feel what that family meeting did to you. You saw power bend and trust break. And you might be wondering what you would do if you were Aisha, standing there with nothing but a promise and the smell of lemon on your sleeves. What would you do if you had to choose to protect someone who has everything or to protect your own mother who has almost nothing? What would you type below right now? Write the word protect or the word expose and tell us why. Your comment helps other viewers see how they would act in that impossible moment and builds a conversation that matters. We read every comment and we use them to shape the next chapters of this story. Now, back to what happens in the house, because the decision that followed made history. The pact was formalized with papers and with hesitation. Kofi drafted a trust that named a guardian and an unusual clause that would only activate upon specific medical certification. Samuel signed and left his fingerprint on documents that smelled of new ink and leather. He negotiated money that would secure a modest house for Nneka, a guaranteed school fund for Mariam, and a trust that would pay for Aisha should anything happen to her. The family argued, negotiated, threatened. There were whispered offers of bribery, a conversation where Lillian suggested a counteroffer. Marcus muttered about disinheritance and public scandal, and Helena wept quietly in a room while a maid named Grace brought water and a towel. In private, Samuel asked Kofi to draft an ironclad clause while he asked Aisha in a separate exchange if she truly understood the risks. She said, "I understand," and he said, "There will be medical steps." And she asked, "Will it hurt?" And he said, "Perhaps," and she nodded. The world outside did not notice yet, but inside the house, the plan moved like a slow train with many stops. Time folded into waiting and tests. The first sign came as a late-night text and then as a medical report that smelled of toner and hospital bleach. Aisha felt a nausea that tasted like metal in her mouth, and then a shock of happiness that fluttered like wings. She took morning tea, the liquid warm and heavy, and at the clinic she heard the rustle of paper and the soft beep of monitors when the doctor said the words, 2 lines. The house erupted in a hush. Lillian screamed into a pillow. Marcus put on a face like iron and walked out into the garden where the smell of wet earth was strong, and where he breathed in like someone trying to drown out a thought. Samuel sat very still, and for a moment the monitors took the rhythm of his name. The test was at first private, then impossible to keep, and soon the word spread beyond the walls to neighbors and then to a reporter named Elias who liked stories with clash. The reveal of the pregnancy became a public crucible. There were confrontations at breakfast that lasted more than an hour, where accusations were thrown like plates. Aisha was questioned by Helena in a conversation that looped and stung. Helena asked, "Who is the father?" And Aisha said, "You know it is for Samuel." And Helena laughed and said, "He is not well enough for promises." And that only hardened Samuel. There were 10 or more exchanges in that scene, each sentence carrying the weight of a possible ruin. The household divided, and the air tasted of coffee and indignation. The family mounted legal maneuvers, and the press circled like vultures.
Kofi advised sealing the trust further and offered a confidentiality agreement that smelled of legal ink. Marcus sought out old acquaintances in the business world to leverage public opinion. Lillian hired a private investigator named Inspector Dlamini to look into Aisha and find anything that could discredit her. Tunde intercepted mail and once heard a conversation between a neighbor and a taxi driver that suggested someone might be leaking details. A plan emerged to move Aisha and the promised child to a small coastal house under a different name and to register the birth quietly. Aisha felt betrayed by the cold calculus, and yet she also felt fear of being left alone with a secret that could make her family safe or make her a target. There were clandestine phone calls with names like Maria, with whispers over static, and a hastily arranged flight that smelled of toner,
of jet fuel and cheap perfume. Samuel, whose health wavered, insisted on being present for the first transfer of documents and for the oath that would secure the trust. In a series of short, urgent exchanges, he asked, "Are you ready to leave now?" And she said, "I am ready." And Helena said, "This will not stand," and she reached for a phone. The flight out was quiet and stuffed with small belongings, and a single locked briefcase that contained legal documents and a recording. The reveal came not as the family expected. Months later, when the child arrived, a boy whose skin matched Aisha and whose cry filled a small guest room in a hospital smelling of antiseptic and boiled tea, the world waited for a neat headline. Instead, Aisha did something that would be called by some a betrayal and by others an act of courage. She arranged for a journalist, Elias, to meet her in a market and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of the trust, the recording of Samuel on a sleepy afternoon making his wish and saying things nobody thought a man of his station would say, and receipts that showed payments into a small foundation for the village that Samuel had promised would be built. She also, in the envelope, placed a letter she had written to the child explaining why she had taken the risk and that he would know the truth when he was old enough. Elias published the documents. The world lit up. Headlines called it a scandal and a revelation. Comment threads churned with indignation and compassion in equal measure. The family accused Aisha of blackmail and of exposing private matters. Supporters of Aisha called her a guardian of truth. The exchange of words in public hearings that followed numbered in the dozens, with lawyers and pundits and ordinary people arguing into microphones. The revelation shocked the public because it stripped away the tidy cloak of power and showed a frail man asking for something that most people would call ethically dubious, and a woman choosing between silence and what she saw as justice. There were 3 moments where the tension moved slow enough to taste. The first moment was the night Samuel signed the trust. He sat with a pen that felt too heavy, his breath shallow. Memory flooded him of a boy stealing mangoes and of a small woman he had loved and lost. His hands shook with both the disease and the weight of his name. In that silence, he thought about legacy and how it would be read in obituaries. The second moment came during the family confrontation when Helena pressed a fork into the table and asked the simplest, brutal question, "Who are you protecting?" When Aisha answered, her voice trembled, and all at once the room was physically small and loud. The third came when Aisha handed the envelope to Elias in the market, the light falling across mangoes and the preki. Smell of cooked cassava hanging in the air. She remembered her mother folding clothes by a dim bulb and felt a tremor in her chest that was equal parts fear and resolve. Each of these moments stretched into internal memory like slow film replay, and each contained a decision point that changed everything. The legal fallout unfolded in courtrooms and in boardrooms and in private negotiation rooms. Samuel, reduced in health, watched as Kofi fought to keep clauses intact and as Helena mounted public relations campaigns to paint Aisha as an opportunist. Marcus filed a challenge to the trust and hired a forensic accountant named Grace to trace the origins of funds. There were depositions and recordings and a medical report from Dr. Amara that became evidence in a hearing. Aisha found allies in unexpected people: a local pastor named Pastor Mwamba, who offered shelter for the child; a nurse named Lillian, who had once been a maid herself and who testified to the truth of Aisha's character;
and an investigative journalist, Elias, who refused money and wanted the full story told. There were betrayals, too. A neighbor named Samuelson who leaked a picture for cash, and a lawyer who once promised support and later took a retainer from the family. The courtroom scenes were thick with dialogue, with at least 8 exchanges per witness cross-examination, and the smell of old wood and lemon polish on the benches. The public began to split between those who saw greed and those who saw courage, and the word inheritance became a moral battleground. 1 month later, the small house by the coast had a swing, and the boy slept in a cot made by Joseph, who came to help. Aisha walked the shoreline with the child in her arms, and the air tasted of salt and possibility. The community had raised funds, and the small foundation Samuel had promised began with one roof. People in the village came to the little house with cassava and sugar, and the pastor blessed the child. Aisha kept a copy of the trust folded in a tin box, and sometimes she opened it to read the words Samuel had spoken about legacy and regret. 3 months later, the legal challenge had produced temporary protection for the child and a court order that prevented the family from removing him. The media cycle had moved on to another scandal, but there were podcasts and articles that revisited the story and reprinted lines from the recording where Samuel had said, "I want my name to mean something more than factories and numbers." The boy at 3 months laughed in his sleep and rolled his tiny fists. 6 months after the birth, the case still simmered with appeals, and a leaked document suggested that a foreign investment group had ties to a trust that Samuel had once considered dissolving. The small house had 2 solar panels and a painted door, and the little community began to call the boy Puti, by a name they chose together. Aisha sometimes stood at the doorway and listened to the ocean and thought about the price she had paid and the price she might still pay. In the months that followed, public opinion remained split and investigations continued. A formal probe into Samuel's business dealings began after a recording in which he admitted to back-channel negotiations with officials surfaced. The family lost a friend in the boardroom and gained a new enemy in the public. Aisha became a symbol in some circles, a symbol of resilience, and in others, a lightning rod for scandal. She wrote a short letter to the child and left it sealed in the tin box with the trust and the recording. Kofi Mensah negotiated a settlement that kept portions of the estate intact but created an independent trust for the boy and for community projects. Inspector Dlamini faced disciplinary proceedings for leaking documents, and Elias, the journalist, won an award for exposé but refused public praise. Samuel died 6 months after the birth, with a face that, at last, in a photo, looked quieter than in any boardroom portrait. His obituary mentioned a dispute over a trust and a final wish that had become a national conversation. The child grew with the ocean in his ears and the name that combined both families. The story did not end with a courthouse or a headline. It ended with a woman holding a child and a small house by the coast, and a legacy reframed into something that a ledger could not fully capture. If you had to choose, in that hush between power and dignity, what would you do? Would you protect, or would you expose? Leave your word below and tell us why. Subscribe if you want to follow the next chapter, because what happens now will decide not only an inheritance, but a question about who gets to write history.